When we think of Tudor theatre, it's of Shakespeare, of a very refined pursuit that was only enjoyed by those at the top of society. But was it really like that? So Tom, you're a leading expert in theatre. Can you give us just a very brief potted history of theatre in England?
Sure. So theatre starts really, as we understand it, from the medieval period, where plays are either plays which are done in the street, which are mystery plays, which are done around the Feast of Corpus Christi, or they're morality plays, which are done in great halls or inns. And that develops right through up to Shakespeare's time. And Shakespeare works in purpose-built theatres for the first time, and that's quite a big development. One of the things when we talk about Tudor theatre is it's quite difficult to define what it is. There's a whole range of activities going on, from saints' plays, so there's plays like the play of Mary Magdalene, which takes the whole of her life, which are going on probably in churchyards, possibly in inns as well. Then, of course, there are all the performances and the theatrical events going on in the great halls, like the one here at Hampton Court, but across the country. And then there are also kind of folk performances and mummings and those kind of things. So there's a whole range of theatrical activity going on, certainly throughout the Tudor period.
And what about the Tudor monarchs themselves? Were they great patrons of theatre?
Henry VII, not so much. Henry VII was a man who was very, very anxious about his status. Henry VIII was a great patron of court entertainments and pageants and those kind of things, and he spent a lot of money on them. Then, of course, we have Edward. Now, Edward was, as far as we know, quite an extreme Protestant. Protestantism has a very ambiguous relationship with theatre, but when the Reformation first starts, there are lots of Protestants who are using theatre for propaganda purposes. So Mary comes back, and Mary, of course, is a Catholic and is quite committed to theatre, and then we go into Elizabeth. It's quite difficult to say the extent to which Elizabeth was a patron of the theatre. Theatre flourished under her. She certainly, or people around her, certainly protected theatre at times from people who wanted to stop it. The extent to which she was a direct patron is more difficult to prove.
That's interesting because she's always hailed as a great patron of theatre. I mean, films such as Shakespeare in Love show her actually going incognito to the theatre. Could that ever have happened, do you think?
No, absolutely not.
Short answer.
But, no, for two reasons. One is she would never ever expose herself to that level of danger. Equally, I think actually it's quite unlikely she would have sat through a whole play. It's not the way court works. So if they get bored, they'll just leave. And particularly Henry VIII, it's impossible to imagine him sitting through a play and not wanting to get up, either to take part in it or just to leave. You know, theatres are located outside the city walls. And they're outside the city walls because they're like brothels and inns. It's not the kind of place that someone like Elizabeth for sure would ever go to. That's
amazing, because now theatre is seen as one of the more highbrow forms of entertainment, but actually back then it's on a par with brothels. What about the actors? Were they professional actors? Did they have other jobs?
Well, actors are classified with vagabonds. So that at one level, they're the bottom of the social order, but they would have been professionals, definitely, because they didn't rehearse in the way that we now think of rehearsals. So they weren't given the whole play. They were only given their parts and the cue lines. They learnt their parts on their own. Then they come together 2 or 3 days before the show. It would have felt much more improvised.
And Shakespeare, I mean, when you say that name, it absolutely dominates the Tudor age, particularly the Elizabethan age. But is that fair? When you look at the Tudor age as a whole, was it in fact Shakespeare's plays that were dominating, really?
He is very, very important. But in terms of theatre history throughout the 16th century, of course, he's only really active from about 1585, 1590s, and then through to 1620. So it's very, very short, kind of almost pop-up theatre. But of course, the rest of the century, there's all kinds of other theatre going on as well. Mm. So there are 2 places in England where we know for a fact that Shakespeare's plays were performed in his lifetime. This is one of them. So Shakespeare and his company performed here. Mm-hmm. But we don't know where the stage was set. We don't know any of that. We do know a bit about how many candles were used.
Okay.
Candles are more expensive than actors. So that's why we know those kind of things.
Can you tell me a bit more about the sorts of people who would have gone to the theatre and watched plays?
Certainly with Shakespeare, the audience is varied. There are groups we know went because people complain about them going. So there's a lot of complaint about apprentices going, and there's a lot of complaint about merchants' wives going. The thing about Shakespeare's theatre is one of the things which makes it subversive is that where you sit depends on your wealth. Now, for us, that seems obvious, whoever's prepared to spend the most gets to sit in the best seat. In Elizabethan society, it's your blood, it's your nobility which determine where you stand in the hierarchy.
What about masques? Now, they are more associated with the Jacobean era, but were they around in the Tudor period as well?
Often nobility would put on plays. Certainly under Henry, masques and pageants are commissioned very explicitly for a particular event. But they're much more like an opera. So there's a lot of singing, a lot of dance. The audience invariably gets up and dances as part of the action. And the other really significant thing is that women took part in them. Certainly we know that women weren't allowed on stage in Shakespeare's theatre, in the public theatre in London. But that is the exception. So it's quite possible that women were allowed on stage in the medieval period, and we know for a fact that they performed in Jacobean masques.
Well, one very famous woman who took part in a performance, not necessarily a play, was Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, wasn't it?
So there's a famous story of Anne Boleyn taking part in a masque, and that being the time when Henry VIII sees her and first is attracted to her. That's quite possible. So there's lots of stories of people using pageants to almost, as it were, display daughters. You know, and of course, that's what the court is partly for.
I always rather like the fact that it's said that Anne Boleyn played the role of Perseverance, which would prove quite appropriate given her later history.
I think what's also interesting is there's a play called The Play of the Weather, which is performed around about 1532-33, so just at the point where Anne Boleyn's going to get married. In fact, they've just got married, probably, Henry and Anne Boleyn. And there's a great speech in it, which is a speech where someone talks about Jupiter. And Jupiter's not around because he's in the process of making a new moon. So his old moon was very leaky and unpleasant and sort of dying. And he's going to have this new moon who's going to be beautiful and wonderful. And of course, that's a little speech telling the court that Catherine Aragon's on the way out, the old moon, and the new moon, Anne Boleyn, is coming in. That's a very typical example of how politics impacts on the theatre in this period. It's by displacement, it's by wink, wink, nudge, nudge, but it's there all the time.
As propaganda.
Absolutely, as propaganda and as a way of letting people know what's happening. So the classic example is Midsummer Night's Dream. So Midsummer Night's Dream is a play written towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. There's a character in it who's a fairy queen. The fairy queen is one of Elizabeth's titles. So there's Shakespeare talking about Elizabeth. In the play, the fairy queen ends up falling in love with an ass and almost certainly having sex with the ass. That's the subtext. So for the audience, you've got this slight titillation that what the play is actually inciting you to fantasize about is Elizabeth and her sex life. Now, Shakespeare, of course, distances this and displaces it so that he can't be accused of anything. But then at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, Puck says, if our play has offended you, think of it as one of your dreams. And of course, that's very clever, because what is actually Puck, Shakespeare's saying there is, if this has offended you, it's you. It's your dream, it's your fantasy, not mine. We've just done this little play. So it's a classic move from Shakespeare.
Absolutely, nothing to do with me.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing to do with me, it's your fault.